All right, now I'm going to go ahead with the introduction. So, Tex Thompson is an instructor for the Writer's Path at SMU and the author of the internationally published Children of the Drought series. She's also the founder and chief instigator for Word, writers organizations around Dallas. When she's not leading the charge at home in Dallas, Tex brings her particular brand of red pen enthusiasm to conferences, conventions, and workshops all over the country. Thanks for your participation, everyone. Enjoy the class.
All right, and thank you, Evan, for hosting. I take back those ugly things I absolutely never said about you. You're all right. You can stay. So yeah, and y'all, thank you so much for joining us and for tuning in and for doing this with me live. I wanted to start, I'm going to be pulling up my screen here to get us rolling. And while I'm doing that, I just wanted to say that, first of all, I'd like to apologize for the last minute date change from Tuesday to Wednesday. I know we did that to you on very short notice, and I must take full responsibility. That was entirely me and not the Writers League, but I really appreciate your rolling with the punches, and I would love to help you get as much out of this class as humanly possible. So normally when I present this, it's live and in person, and I use a lot of audience interaction. I know that that's a little harder to do when I have a voice and all you have is a keyboard, but I would love and encourage you to ask questions and use that chat box throughout the presentation. You really don't need, I will stop and ask for questions periodically, but it's really okay to ask them as you have them. One of the nice things about a chat box is you can type something and it doesn't interrupt me or anyone else. So we can always, you know, stop and pause when it's convenient to answer that question that you have. I would especially love to encourage you to do that here, in part because I know some of our folks are only going to be able to listen to the recorded version, so they won't get to ask the in-person real-time questions that you can. So you may be helping out not just yourself, but other attendees that you can't see. So with that said, we will go ahead and get rolling, and I will make this as scintillating and devastatingly informative and excruciatingly fantastic as humanly possible. But the short story is that this class started out as Prose P90X until we realized that some people didn't know what Prose P90X was as an exercise program. But it was essentially, this course was formed between myself and an editor named Laura Maizano. She's an editor for Anaya Press, which is a small press. And the two of us kind of worked together on this class to give it a joint perspective between an author, I was the author at that time, and an editor, an acquiring editor, so we could kind of share our what we had learned about how to clean up and how to tighten and how to improve manuscripts that may be getting rejected simply for style concerns, even though they have an excellent premise or an excellent story. So what I'd like to do before we get rolling, can you guys, if you are ready to go and you are on board and ready to kick off, can you go ahead and hit that raise hand button for me so that I can make sure that I can see those and that we are all good to go? Oh, beautiful. Oh, fantastic. All right. Perfect. Thank you so much for doing that, team. I really appreciate it. So we'll go ahead and get rolling. So to kick off, to get started, one of the first things that we'd like to talk about generally is the difference between grammar and style. And grammar, which we'll cover in more depth for that sparkling sentences and glitzy grammar presentation on the 10th, if you're interested, right? That's we generally know what that is. That's our set of rules governing the standard use of language, right? But I want to talk about that as opposed, I'd rather talk today or tonight about style, namely an individual author's use of language and how that usage affects the text, right? Those personal choices that you make in your work and how to make those choices more effective, how to make them do better for you. So today we are 95% about style. And I thought what we could do normally is we could kind of divide this into a couple of pieces. Phase one, we'll call cutting the fat, and that is 5 hot tips for eliminating extra words, just for slimming down, trimming down the story that you have without sacrificing the story itself, you know, just improving or streamlining the telling of it. And then we'll take a break. And when we come back from that break, we can do part 2, which I've been calling Building Muscles, but it's basically 5 hot tips for taking what's left after you trim out the excess and making it more powerful, making it more clear, you know, just amping it up so it adds resonance. So we are here to lose that last 10%. I hope you can hear that Richard Simmons sweating to the oldies video in the background, because that's what we're doing, y'all. We are doing introvert calisthenics tonight from the comfort of your own chair. So let's get to it. Let's get rolling. First thought, before we get started, could you please, as a keyboard test, just in the chat box, briefly give me your first impression of this yellow room that you see before you? How does that seem to you? All right. Yeah, it's kind of busy. It's kind of cluttered, right? Too much. Yeah, exactly, right? And the thing is, so first of all, yes, thank you for saying that, because you're right. It's not that it's, and let's be clear, right? This is not something we're going to find on an episode of Hoarders. Everything in here is nice. It's not dusty. It's not junky. It's not broken. There's no dirt. There's no trash. But there is a lot of it, right? And I think that, you know, we don't have to go completely to the modern style, but that a lot of times in our prose, modern prose fashion kind of tends to mimic modern design fashion, which is leaning away from the more ornate styles that were more popular in previous decades and more toward a cleaner and simpler look. I don't think we have to go, I've been calling this red and white room here the Hemingway, and I don't think we have to do that to go to that extreme. But you can see how in our second example here, it's much easier to see what you're meant to focus on. There are a couple of key accents that really draw your attention, and you can be confident that that you're meant to notice them. So keeping that thought in mind then, let's think about our, oh, well, I used to call it the food pyramid, but then they changed it. You know, it was a food circle, and then it was a food pyramid, and then it was a kind of stripy pyramid, and now it's back to something else. I don't know. It's a food pentahedron or something. But go back to the good old days of the food pyramid, right? And let's think about you know, what an individual sentence is made out of. I promised we weren't going to do too much grammar, and we won't, but just briefly, right? For a complete sentence, we have to have a verb. And what else? Usually, what else would you say is really essential to having a complete sentence? Yeah. Oh, Callie, you're right. You don't. Evan, you're right. You got to have that. You got to have a subject. Usually, you have to have a noun, right? So if a verb is if your main verb is the king of your sentence, our nouns and pronouns come next, right? The things that we're talking about. We also need a fair dose of prepositions and of conjunctions. And then what is probably occupying that fats and sweets up at the top of the pyramid? What are we constantly cautioned about overusing? Yeah. Yeah, Wendy, you got it, right? Callie, you got it, right? Those adjectives and adverbs. And again, just like with literal sugar and literal fat, it's not that we're supposed to have none. It's that these may be the parts of speech that are most easy to overuse, simply because they're often hiding a better word underneath that could be more simply rendered, right? So instead of saying ran quickly, we might be able to say dashed, or instead of saying very beautiful, we might be able to say gorgeous. So right. So part of what we're going to be looking at is how to bring your prose kind of in line with this pyramid sort of ideal, so that you've got the parts of speech in ideal proportions for your genre, for your purpose. To do that, let's roll into our 5 hot tips here. Number 1. We start by saying pulverize purple prose. And before we do that, what I should actually ask, what is purple prose to your mind, or what have you heard about it? Ah, okay. So Callie, you said you hadn't heard about it before. Well, then good. I'm so glad. Well, first of all, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is something that I think gets used a lot in certain writing circles, but it may not have come into yours. It's an older term, and we'll start. Let me give you an example. Right. It was a dark and stormy night. The rain fell in torrents, except at occasional intervals when it was checked by a violent gust of wind which swept up the streets. For it is in London that our scene lies, rattling along the housetops and fiercely agitating the scanty flame of the lamps that struggled against the darkness. And Joan, I think what you're saying about overwriting, right? That's it. This is what there's an agent out there. Her name is Anne Collette, and she calls this, "Look, Ma, I'm writing." And the truth is that when Edward Bulwer-Lytton first wrote this sentence, he was writing for quite a different audience than we were. He was writing in the 19th century when the standards were a bit different. But the short answer is that purple prose is essentially, we most often think of it as writing that calls attention to the writing itself at the expense of the story. You might think of it as, if normally prose is kind of a clear glass through which we look to see the story play out in our minds, this is coloring that glass. It's forcing our attention back up to the surface. Just like when you're, like at an aquarium or something, if the glass is dirty and smudgy and there's something right up on the surface, or how you can't take good pictures through your car windshield if there's bug splatter all over it, our attention is being forced back up toward the surface to notice that writing, and it's detracting sometimes from the immersion that our readers would like to have. So, my next question then is, thinking about this, the thing is, we are fundamentally smart and reasonable people. I mean, you're here in this class, so obviously you're pretty sharp and you're making a lot of good life choices. So when are we most likely to accidentally create a giant word wad like this one on the screen here? At what points in the creation process might that happen to us? Even though most of our prose is great, where do you suppose you might be especially vulnerable to this problem? Yeah, excellent answers. Yes, and share. We should talk. That's an excellent question too, about adding richness without going purple. Let's hit that together. Put a pin in that, because we will talk about it. But yeah, Wendy, to your point, your first draft, absolutely. Because the job of the first draft, right, is to exist. It's not to be good. It's simply to be. Our first draft is us pouring sand into the sandbox. We are not going to worry about shaping and making beautiful castles until we get much later. We get to the revision stage. So, in fact, you remind me of something I should have said before we even got started. All of the things that we're talking about tonight are techniques for revision. And if that's not where you are right now, that's okay. I think you can still learn a lot by being here with us, and I encourage you to participate as much as you can. But just remember that the techniques we're using right now are not for the first draft, because it is very difficult to create and censor yourself at the same time. When you're doing your first draft, focus only on the creation. When it's time to revise, then we can do a lot of the exercises that we're trying to show tonight, and actually and trim and tone and refine and add that resonance that we're looking for. So yes, and to Joan's point, right, this kind of purple prose is liable to happen to us in descriptive phrases, especially the descriptions of really vitally important things and places and people. Like thinking about in the movies, wherever the background music really swells to a crescendo, like when Darth Vader first appears and the Imperial March is playing in the background, that's a huge entrance. It's a huge moment. And if you're doing that in novel form or in story form, it's very easy to let the writing to let it overproof, I guess you could say, to mix our metaphors, to let it swell beyond the size that it should. Just because you know that's a really important moment in the story, and you really are trying extra hard to get the reader to feel all the right feelings. I would add too that this is the first line of Mr. Bulwer-Lytton's story, and I think first lines, first pages, first chapters are really hard too, because we're having to start the movie playing in the reader's mind. They are starting with literally nothing, and we are having to create an image for them and start them imagining what it is we're describing. So back to Cher's question about how we add richness without doing purple prose. I would say, first of all, it's okay if it's purple at first. Rather than trying to avoid going purple, I think it's a much better strategy to notice purple after it has happened to you and then trim it back down, right? To allow yourself the joy of creation without worrying about your word count. And then later, when it's time to revise, to trim it back to the size it should be. And here's how we can do that. What we can do is whenever you notice one of these big old word wads in your manuscript that you're revising, we can start by identifying the key nouns and the strongest and best verbs. So just briefly in text here, in your text box for me, can you list a few of the words that you would definitely want to keep from this giant mega sentence that we have in front of us? Yeah, excellent. Okay. I think it's, that's so interesting that you guys are picking out a lot of the same things, right? The things that really most inform you about where and when we are, right? And a lot of times those words are also powerful in themselves. So for example, I underlined here, the stormy night, the streets, the housetops, so those nouns that we're really going to get a lot of mileage out of. And then those verbs that you're picking out too, about the swept, the rattling, the torrents. Yeah. The neat thing is, if we go back down to the base of that word pyramid, to the nouns and the verbs, and we look to see, okay, what do I need to let the reader know? We can then use those really vital nouns and verbs and rewrite the sentence to create what we might call one controlling image, right? So here's an example. It was a dark and stormy night, and the wind was rattling the housetops of London. And y'all, that's not Shakespeare, but that does a lot. That lifts a lot of weight. That tells us the time of day. It tells us the weather. It tells us the city, and it even tells us the district of that city, right? We're not at the docks. We're not at the castle. We're in a neighborhood. We're in the housetops. So my next question for you is, if we scale down to give the reader just the really essential information about where and when they are, and to give them some of those exciting action words that they're looking for, the storm and the wind and the rattling and all that good stuff. There is more in this sentence that's probably worth keeping, right? There's this really cool image of the lamps and the flames sort of guttering, but what might we want to put into the story before we do more description? Like, assuming that we will do something about the lamps here in a little minute, what might we need to include before we go back and do that? Yeah. Good thoughts. Yeah. And you guys, Callie, Wendy, yeah. You are all hitting on that same thing. We're gonna want to see a character pretty quickly. So so what we've created now is a thin layer of description that's just enough to establish the scene. Next, we probably are going to want a little layer of what you might call action, but the action could be as simple as you know, some sort of figure, dark and mysterious figure in a hooded cloak, walking up the street and knocking at this one particular door, and the door opens and light spills out from inside, and maybe the opening of the door is what causes that gust of wind that makes the lamp gutter. So yeah, we could have character, we could have action. We don't have it yet in this scene, but I would even say dialogue would be a wonderful thing to get to relatively soon if we can. And to kind of get to some of those other modes briefly, to do small layers of a little layer of description, a little layer of action, which is going to include a character probably, a little layer of dialogue if that's appropriate for your story. Maybe then we're going to be ready for a little bit of layer of description again, maybe some inner monologue or narrative if we're in close point of view. So we're kind of creating, I guess a good way to think of it, especially at the beginning of your story, is often we're trying to create sort of a 7-layer dip for the reader, right? We're going to do just a thin layer of beans, and then a thin layer of guac, and then a thin layer of the lettuce, and then a thin layer of the cheese, so that nobody dips into your story and gets nothing but a giant mouthful of sour cream. We've all been there. It's not an ideal situation, right? So we talk a little bit about this purple prose, and again, I think it's a really a good idea to give yourself. Sorry, just one last thing before we keep moving. To give yourself more than you need in your first draft. You know, to go ahead and describe this scene as much as you feel like you need to, because we can cut it back in revision, and that's going to give you plenty of marble to chip away at to form this beautiful statue that you're creating. So we talked about purple prose a little bit. Let's go on then. Our second hot tip, right, is omit the obvious. And here's what I mean about that. What we might call general implications, to remove things that the reader can easily infer from the surrounding information. In other words, we could even remove the words from the surrounding information, because that's literally what inferred means, right? It's like Laura put that in here. I can't take credit for it, but she's all meta with this stuff. So here's an example that maybe you can help us with. She stood up in the shallow end of the pool and squeezed her wet hair, making water drip back into the pool. And that's a fine first draft sentence. Can you list for me any words you could see that we might be able to snip out to trim that up just a little bit? Yeah, excellent. Excellent. So you guys are you're noticing similar things, right? So first of all, we can, to your point, we can remove up, because unless, the only thing you can stand down from is red alert for those of us Star Trek fans. So we could probably get rid of that. The words of the pool, like what Jonah just mentioned, right? We could just say, because the shallow end, we can probably infer that it's a pool, especially if we're in the middle of a scene. And yeah, we can get rid of the word wet, because if she's squeezing her hair and it's making water drip, then we can infer that it's wet too, right? And I think that Evan made a really good point about this whole last clause here, right? This making water drip back into the pool. Right now, that is kind of workmanlike, but so we could possibly just delete it. But if you really want this to be, you know, a little bit of a moment, or to create a little bit of an image, maybe we could spiff that up a little bit, right? Maybe we could say, she stood in the shallow end and squeezed her hair until it rained tiny dripping ripples, right? We could, you know, kind of just by eliminating some of the words and upgrading a few of the ones that we choose to keep, we could finish the scene with a really nice, like a really nice image or a really nice symbol. And the thing I'd love you to notice about this, what we just did here, right? We took that from 22 words down to 16. This is dropping almost a third of the word count weight. And I know it's just one sentence, but y'all, this stuff adds up. It really does. Yeah. So, and in fact, since we've talked about it in singular sentence form, what I'd really like to do with you now is to think about it in a slightly larger way, the way you might see on an entire page. What I would like to do is to read to you a piece from an author I worked with. Her name is Anastasia Marie. She gave me an early draft of her novel, Breaking Earth, which is a kind of a science fiction thriller. And she gave me permission to share this with you because what she and I worked on really, really improved, I think, the tightness of her prose. So I'd like to read this out loud so you can hear some of the extra words, and I will be asking you to suggest ones that we might be able to trim and to cut, just as we have been. So feel free, if you're ahead of me, to go ahead and start making your chat box list of things that you can hear that we could maybe do without. So here we go. Oh, tell me this isn't what I think it is, he thought, stopping at one of the burned areas. If he was right, then the sky tower of the Universal Bureau of Investigation had just become a crime scene. With the thought, he saw a chair fall over seemingly of its own volition and start sliding across the floor. That chair was followed by others. Oh my God, the tower, it's falling, he realized, making a run for the door. He stopped when he reached it, though, remembering why he was there. The other members of the Psychic Society were still locked away. David thought that he might have enough time to get to them if he knew where they were being held. And y'all, the thing I love about this piece, and the reason I'm so glad that Anastasia was willing to let us use it as a teaching tool, is because I think she has chosen a wonderful place to start her story. This what we're looking at right now, this is not page 1, it's about page 2. But you're in the opening scene with me here, and you can see how we have a lot of really good ingredients for starting the story. We have a character with a specific goal, with a real sense of urgency. We have a rapidly changing situation. You know, here's this guy up in this floating tower trying to find his friends and realizing he's about to have a much bigger problem. So I think she's chosen a fantastic scene, a fantastic character to start her story with. And that's going to let us focus on how to improve that execution, how to improve that telling. So yeah, let's get your list then. So Cher said, if he was right, he realized, David thought, yeah. And Kali, I see you have some of the same words about thought and realized. Yeah, when he reached it. Good, very good. And those, yeah, absolutely. So here's what we can do. Oh, and Joan, I'm so glad you said that about the word just. Y'all, I don't know if you do this too, but there are words that personally I overuse. I just beat them until they cry, and just is one of them, right? I think you've probably heard some of the others that we tend to overuse, like then, and oh, what are some of the others? Quite, yes. Seemingly, yes. Excellent, right, or very. Yeah, I had an editor say once that this was back in the academic world. She says, I want you to do a find and replace on your draft and replace every single word very with the word damn. It'll still get taken out and you will lose nothing. I don't know if that's true. I didn't challenge her on it. But yes, there's quite a lot of those little words that are easy to overuse, right? So here's what we can do. Is if we go and first of all, delete the easy inferences. And those are some of the things that you have just now listed for us, right? Seemingly of its own volition. Okay, well, the thing is, if we say that a chair falls and we don't say how it happened or who did it or what was the cause, then yeah, probably the reader is going to assume poltergeist or whatever, right? So if the reader is going to assume the right thing without you explicitly saying it, then probably we can delete the saying of it. And to what you all had noticed, right? He stopped when he reached it, though, as opposed to what? Like plowing through the door like the Kool-Aid Man? No, of course he stopped when he reached it, right? Or remembering why he was there, right? So that's our part 2. We're going to come back to this example here we have more improvements to make to these couple of paragraphs, and we're going to kind of work through those with our next tips. And in fact, Joan, I think I'm glad that you mentioned about the dialogue and the O too, because that's something we want to talk about as well. So for now, hold on to our Breaking Earth example, and let's go talk about this tip 3, which is redacting redundancy, right? Redundancy, this is another thing I got to give Laura a lot of credit for when she helped us build this presentation. So that can include doubled words, like each and every, any and all, hopes and dreams, you know, words that kind of come in the twin size package. That can include redundant modifiers, because, you know, what other kind of tragedy is there except a terrible one? Or what other kind of outcome is there but a final one? Right? Or it can include redundant categories. She was, you know, he was honest in character. Well, I mean, honest cannot apply to any other category but character. So we could probably send and delete that. And the thing, remember too, y'all, as we're talking about this, is your characters, you know, what goes between the quotation marks in your writing, there is almost no limitation to it. We all speak in rough draft. What's gonna, I think, really distinguish you as an excellent wordsmith is the fact that you will have these kinds of cliches in your dialogue as is appropriate for whichever characters it may be appropriate for, but that's going to be noticeably different than the narrative, which is you and not your character. And that's one of the ways you can subtly signal to the reader that, yes, you know what you're doing, regardless of how educated your character sounds or how original they sound or how cliche they are, that you have a superior control over your language and that you're able to change it substantially as needed. So, thinking about that redundancy, right? If we go back to our Breaking Earth example, those repeated or redundant nouns and actions, we can delete when he reached it, because again, we said, okay, of course he stopped at the door. He's not going to go through it. Or we notice, right? He saw a chair fall over, and then we say that chair was followed by others. What might be more, what might be better to use there? Rather than just repeating the same noun twice in as many sentences, how could we quicken that up a little bit? Or what would you normally use? Yeah, LA, perfect, right? Like the word it. A chair fell over and started sliding across the floor. It was followed by others. This is why we have pronouns. They work perfectly for those situations. And it's also one of the reasons I do recommend, we'll talk more about this later in the evening, but reading your work out loud can help you hear those word echoes. So yeah, so we'll delete those repeated nouns and actions. And then to the point that most of you really pointed out in what you gave us just a few minutes ago, let's pause for a big minute here and talk about our distancing words. This is going to be our tip number 4, is deleting distancing words. And the short story is that distancing words, which you may have also heard called filter words, are words that hold the reader apart from the character and may be detracting from their immersion. So here are some examples, right? Saw, heard, thought, felt, wondered, realized. It's not that these are terrible words that you should never have in your manuscript, but they do sort of serve to subconsciously emphasize that the character is the one seeing these amazing things. The character is the one hearing these things or doing these things or wondering these things. And you're just sitting there on the couch and really, shouldn't you get a job? What are you doing writing a novel on a Saturday afternoon anyway, right? So they kind of hold the reader sometimes apart from the character. But more than that, the big beef I have with too many of these is that they are occupying your priceless, high value main verb real estate. So for example, let's say we have a sentence like, she heard a gunshot. And I mean, that's probably connected to something really exciting. It's not a bad sentence, but that word heard is currently occupying main verb territory. And what I'm interested to know is what verb actually makes you think of a gunshot? What does a gunshot do? If it were to be the subject of the sentence, like a gunshot blank. Yeah. Wendy, look, it makes a bang sound, right? So you could say, if you hadn't taken up that main verb slot with this heard, you could say a gunshot cracked the air, or a gunshot rang out, right? And then it's not the character who's hearing it, it's actually much more the reader who's going to be hearing that in their mind. So these distancing words, it's not that we want to have none ever. It is true that they can sometimes creep out more than they should in the work. And the ones that we've listed on the screen here are just some examples. This is not a full and complete list. That's me using doubled modifiers again. So there's lots and lots of these. So let's practice for a second. Before we go back to our main example, let's read out this example, and I'd like you to pick out as many of the distancing words as you hear. Big Jim heard the sounds of the other guys grunting as they exercised. He wondered if they'd let him cut in. He looked around the corner and saw the track team hogging the weight machines. He knew he'd have to wait his turn. All right, y'all, what distancing words can you pick out there? Excellent. Yeah. When looked, yep, good. Right, so we've got a lot, right? We've got heard, we've got wondered, we've got looked and saw and knew, right? And the thing about these distancing words is we can't just delete them and keep going, right? They are taking up that main verb real estate, so we're gonna have to replace them with something. But if we're thoughtful in doing that replacement, here's what we can turn it into. The other guys grunted as they exercised. Would they mind if he cut in? Just around the corner, the track team was hogging the weight machines. Again, damn, he'd have to wait his turn, right? And you can hear how, so first of all, we actually do have fewer words, right? So we've cut it down by 20%. But we haven't just cut it down, we've also added more of that interiority for our guy Jim, right? We can now feel him more, hear his mind a little bit more as we read. And that's, I think, the effect of cutting down those words and controlling how often you use them. And LA, you betcha. Let me hang on a second. I'll be happy to put that list back up. Oh, and you know what? Actually, I'm really glad you asked. Y'all, if you would like a more comprehensive list of these words, I recommend Googling distancing words fiction or filter words fiction. Even if you're doing memoir or something like that. Your Google search string is going to work better if you include the word fiction at the end of it, so that it takes out the results that have to do with writing better corporate emails and things like that. The term distancing and filter words are used in business writing as well, but our list is going to be a little bit different than theirs because we're talking about narrative. So I do absolutely recommend getting one of those lists and kind of familiarizing yourself with it. And as we said before, right, we're not going to just say no distancing words ever, but we do want to be really aware of them as we reread and revise our work. And because, as you'll notice with Anastasia's example here, right, if we delete the distancing words, that's going to get rid of thought and another thought and saw and realized and thought, and knew. And the thing is, if she has this many in just 2 paragraphs, chances are there's a lot of them in the draft as a whole. Maybe not quite so many. She may have less once she kind of hits her stride, once she really gets into the narrative flow. Beginnings are hard for everybody. But I would say, looking at our edits so far, we've only got a couple of the other 2 of those redundancies. We've only got a couple of those inferences, but I'm seeing a lot of these distancing words. So that might be, if I'm her developmental editor, that would be something I might recommend that this writer look at in the manuscript as a whole and actually do a search through the whole manuscript for, okay, how many new do you have? How many thought do you have? Not with the goal of expunging every last one of them, but thinking, okay, that may be one change that she could make that would significantly boost up her writing. So let's pause here because this distancing words, I think, is really important. Let me go ahead and ask now for any questions you have about distancing words or about just the things that we've covered so far. If you would like to ask a question, please go ahead and put the raise hand icon up so that I know not to keep moving and so we can give you time to type. Okay, so I don't see any hands up at the moment, so I'm going to assume that means that you are ready to continue. If you are mid-question, go ahead and finish typing it. I'll be happy to pause so we can answer that if we need to. For now, we've talked about redundancy, distancing words, a lot of good stuff. So what I'd like to do, this number 5 is one that's really important to me. It's about leaving something unsaid. And here's the thought I have with that. Let's pause for a second. I know we're deep into the grammar and style weeds here, but y'all, I think we need to talk about cake. Oh, and actually, before we talk about cake, we'll meditate on cake here in a second. But Wendy, you bring up a good point about adding the words "he thought" to a line of obvious interior monologue. And you know, I am super glad that you asked about that. So I think our question is, right, do you have to, can you, should you, must you, if you have an interior line of thought? Let me back up so we can use our example from Anastasia, right? When we have, oh, tell me this isn't what I think it is, or, oh my God, the tower, it's falling. Right? That's interior monologue. The character is thinking exactly what they would be saying out loud. It's just that they're not saying it. And there was a time I would have told you, no, you don't need to add the words "he thought," because it should be clear and obvious just by looking at it. Okay, it's italicized, and you know it's clear whose point of view we're in, and so on. So to the eye, I think it's pretty obvious, you know, if you've done a good job establishing your point of view and you format it correctly, to the eye, it should be pretty clear that this is a character's internal monologue and you shouldn't need the words "he thought." However, and this is a big one that I did not realize until after my first books came out, that italics is not going to show up in the audiobook, and neither are quotation marks. And so even though it may be obvious that, okay, so here David is the only character we have in the scene, and so any line, exterior or interior, would be coming from him. You know, even though we're not at risk of confusing who is speaking, we still, in the audiobook version, the narrator doesn't have a great way to convey which verbatim thoughts are coming in out loud, they're coming out of his mouth, and which ones are staying in his head. And sometimes that's a really big deal. You know, if your character is in a situation and they're thinking a real ugly thought, like, wow, Becky, you sure do look fat in that dress. We gotta know, did she just say that? Or did she just think it real loudly? So that would be, if you are going to include, you know, sort of those tags for the interior monologue, like the "he thought" or "he realized" right here, I think that's an excellent case for leaving some of those words in, is if you want to add clarity and avoid in the audio version. And remember, team, that even though you may not have even if you're just doing a short story, even if you're not creating your own separate audiobook version, your reader may very well be using their Kindle to read aloud to them in the computer voice if they have any kind of visual impairment or even just preference. You know, if their eyes are busy but their hands are free, you know, if they're driving or something. I read client manuscripts on my Kindle all the time when I'm on the road. So you never know who's going to be hearing your work instead of reading it with their eyeballs. And I think it's not a bad plan to make your work as maximally user-friendly as you can. Yeah. So thank you for asking that, Wendy. That was a really good question. I hope that you're suitably impressed with the answer, because I had to screw up a lot of stuff before I got to that little light bulb moment, and I am very happy to share it with you. Okay, so let's go back to cake. All right, because cake is super important. So the story about cake is that those cake mixes actually were developed. This was something I didn't know. Cake mixes were developed during World War II as a way to easily provide those baked good type of things to the troops overseas when fresh milk and butter and eggs and things weren't necessarily available. So these were first made for the military. They're first mass produced for the military. And after World War II was over, they worked well and they tasted good. So they thought, well, why not try it for the consumer market? And so they did. But the sales kind of flatlined. They really weren't getting a lot of buy-in from all the housewives that they were hoping were going to pick up this product. And they couldn't really figure out why that was, because they said, well, in all the focus groups, it tastes just as good and it sure is a lot more convenient and it's cheaper. There should be no reason people aren't buying these up in droves. Does anybody know what they had to do, what they had to change before the sales of cake mix actually started to take off? Yeah, Callie, I bet you've heard this before, right? Women didn't feel like they were really those housewives that were being marketed to, right? Felt like, okay, but those people felt like they didn't want to be dump and stir machines, right? That convenience is all well and good, but if you feel like all you are is a robot at a factory, dumping in the cake mix, dumping in the water, stir, pour, bake, have you really made anything, right? And it wasn't until, and here's, you know, Callie, I heard this story. I am a history major too. So I heard this when I was in school, but the thing I didn't hear until much more recently was part of the winning change was this what we're seeing on the ad right here, right? Betty Crocker cake mixes bring you that special homemade goodness because you add the eggs yourself, right? So part of it was that they realized that even though the taste didn't require extra ingredients, psychologically it was really important for the people buying these cake mixes to feel like they were really baking and not just dump and stir. The other part of the cake mix revolution was the innovation in decorating that suggested that, okay, so I might choose to put these little mandarin orange slices on my cake, but maybe you would put coconut or chocolate shavings on yours. And for anybody out there who's big into cake decorating, this is where Wilton got their start, is this revolution that said, we're all going to buy the same cake mix at the store, but our cakes are going to come out looking really different. And that's a good thing because that means we are the baker, the decorator, the original innovator here. Now, not that we ever need a reason to talk about cake, because let's face it, it's amazing. But what does this philosophy, what does this thesis, this takeaway have to do with you and your reader? Why are we talking about cake right here? Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. So Evan, you're dead on point. Callie, same thing. In LA, you're right. That the reader, in reading as in baking, the reader would like to feel like they are contributing in a way, right? That they are actually involved in the story, and that's a little harder for our medium to do. I would say that that's the superpower of a storytelling medium like games. Games are much better at true interactivity than books, right? And to some extent, choose your own adventure stories where you literally can make different choices and turn to page 58 or page 72, depending on what you choose to do. So it's not that that's what we do best, but it is important for us to do it as much as is reasonable. And the thing I really would like to ask you is, what is your very reasonable and natural concern about leaving some things in your story for the reader to deduce, leaving some things in the story for the reader to figure out? What is your very reasonable concern or hesitation about doing that? Yeah, Cal, exactly right? Like, okay, what if they, and Wendy, you're dead on. What if they screw it up, team? What if we tell them to add 2 eggs and they add 2 quail eggs and then get mad because it's too dry? Or what if they add spoiled eggs, and then they're mad because the cake doesn't taste good? Or what if they throw the whole dang egg in there, shell and all, and then they complain because there's pieces in the cake, right? They could mess it up. And so I think, so the thing is, I think that hesitation is a correct one. Now, taking that idea one step further, right? I'm going to come back to cake for a second here. The thing is, if you know that you can't hit this exactly right for every reader every time, if you know that we are constantly walking a knife's edge between confusion and boredom, right? If we tell the reader too much, we don't give them enough to do, they're going to be bored, right? They're just like, oh, this story doesn't need me. If we give them too much to do, or we give them the wrong things to do, they might be confused. So, and then they don't know what's going on, and they could get frustrated. So if we know that we can't hit it perfectly dead on accurate for every reader every single time, what side would you rather err on when you're still in the writing and revision stage? Think about your beta readers, think about your critique partners. Would you rather accidentally bore them, or would you rather accidentally confuse them? Yeah. Wow, we got a unanimous vote, right? And I'm so glad that you guys are pointing to those same things, right? Because if we accidentally confuse our readers, our test readers, our beta readers, our focus group readers, then they can say something like, wait a second, I didn't understand why the guy did the thing. I thought the girl was going to do the thing. And honestly, team, I mean, if that is going to be explained on the very next page that they didn't get to hear that night, great. If they are asking the question that you are about to answer in the next set of pages, that's fantastic compliment. That means they want the answer that you're about to give them, right? And even if they're asking a question you didn't intend, even if they're saying, even if they're asking that question, you're like, wait a second, I thought I already explained very clearly why he did the thing and not her. That does tell you what to perhaps go back and underline a little more clearly, right? That gives you valuable information that you can use to change your writing as you need to. But if you accidentally bore them, if you err on the side of too much, then we hear comments like, I like the part where it ended, right? Or, oh, it just, it didn't grab me. Or, well, it was very well punctuated, right? And those comments are a lot harder to act on. It's harder for your reader to be helpful. Sometimes they can be very sharp and say, well, I think I would be more interested if you had done X or Y. But I think that it's a great idea to err on the side of too little right at first, until you find that sweet spot, until you find the right amount of egg including that is appropriate for your specific genre and your specific audience, right? Yeah, and Joan, I think you make a wonderful point that we're needing a balance here, right? Sometimes the fix is like the confusion may be massive, but the fix could be very small. Just, like what you're saying here in chat, right? That you added 3 more sentences. You didn't even need a whole paragraph, and that fixed it. You can have a giant flood from a very small leak. All we have to do is plug that one little leak, and then we're probably okay. So a couple of examples of what we've been talking about just here, right? There is the famous Ernest Hemingway 6-word short story, For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Worn, right? And that is kind of quintessentially held up as an example of how the emotional impact can be much greater if you don't go out and spell out every little detail, if we leave the reader to do the job of connecting those dots. And because that's a super depressing example, I'll give you another one. It's a little more cheerful. Picture like a cherry red Maserati blazing down the freeway at 90 miles an hour, And on the vanity license plate on the back says "was his," right? And that is delicious, right? That is such a it's a fun image, and it's much better to, you know, to kind of give that image and let the reader connect the dots and get the laugh, right? Rather than just having to spell it out exactly to say, ah, she got everything in the divorce. Thank you for virtually laughing at that joke, by the way, guys. You are really good for my self-esteem. So yes, so it's a big conclusion, right? A good story is like a sponge. It's got holes for the reader to soak themselves into. How big those holes are and how far apart they are depends very much on your genre, on your audience, right? If what you're writing is supposed to be a fun and easy beach read, then we don't want to ask the reader to do as much intensive work as if we're writing Gravity's Rainbow, you know, or something that's designed to be much more puzzle of a book, or, you know, like a really in-depth mystery or something like that. I wish to the dickens that books came. I tell you what, team, you know, I've had 3 books out, and I wish to the goodness they had beer ratings. I wish that books came with little icons on them that said how many beers you could drink before you lose the plot, right? And so that fun, easy beach read might be a 6-beer book. My books are like 1 beer. Gravity's Rainbow is -5, you know, or what is it? Prose in Search of Lost Time is -5. You can't be drinking while you're on the job. You got to study to read that book. And unfortunately, we cannot easily advertise the challenge level of our writing. But what we must do then is make really sure that we have an appropriate challenge rating for our little piece of the bookstore. And that's where I think it's really important, not just to test your regular beta readers who might be writing in very different genres than you are, but to test people of your intended audience. You know, if you are doing contemporary young adult fantasy, if you're doing contemporary young adult story, then we probably need to get that book read by both teens and adults and make sure that you're giving them the appropriate workload for that part of the bookstore. That's the big thrust of it. This is a process of experimentation, y'all, but I think it yields wonderful dividends. And I hope that you will leave plenty of time in your creation process to do this work, to test out and say, okay, probably in your first draft, you may have had way too much. And that's exactly what a first draft is for. So then in revision, that's a wonderful time to start experimenting with what pieces you can take out to actually deepen your reader's enjoyment. That's really the end of my big sermon, but let me pause here and ask, could you, if you have questions or if you have other things you'd like to talk about in that vein, please hit that raise hand button right now so that we know that you have a question that you're going to type for us. Okay. So I don't see any hands, so I'm going to assume that your hands are both up in a big old amen. And we will finish. We can cap this first hour by rewriting that piece that we looked at from Anastasia, right? Once we have done all of those edits that we talked about, once we have taken out the distancing words, the redundancy, the inferences, we can rewrite for immediacy and combining actions where we can. And here's what we end up with. Oh, tell me this isn't what I think it is. If David was right, the Sky Tower of the Universal Bureau of Investigation had just become a crime scene. Then a chair fell over and began sliding across the floor. Then another, then another. Oh my God, the tower, it's falling. David bolted for the door and halted just as quickly. The other members of the Psychic Society were still locked away. He couldn't leave them to die, but where were they? Can you hear it, y'all? Can you hear that snap, that really tight, yeah, that, you know, you could bounce a quarter off of that page right now, right? And the thing I would like to emphasize is that we didn't change any of what actually happened in the story. David is still realizing the same things in the same order. The actions are still happening in the same order. We're not actually sacrificing any of the vital story moments. All we are is tightening up the telling. And thank you, Callie. I am so glad that you are that you approve. And I want to ask, actually, we talked about what we took out, but we haven't really talked about what we put in. So one thing I'd like to ask you all is, what do you notice here now that maybe wasn't there in the first version that we maybe haven't covered yet? Yeah, Sheriff, that immediacy, right? It feels like we're much deeper. And Wendy, I'm so glad you mentioned the ellipsis, or at least I take it that's what you're pointing out right there, right? Those dots, right? Then a chair fell over, and began sliding across the floor, right? So the thing that we might look at here, because this is a really tight, it's supposed to be a really sort of intense and getting scary kind of moment. So these ellipses, first of all, the 3 dots, and also some of those dashes, right? He bolted for the door, dash, and halted just as quickly, right? So what those are doing, the reason that I include them is because those are kind of signaling to the reader. That's almost the punctuation equivalent of the scary background music in a movie that says, hold on to your hats, it's about to get real. It's a pause. It's just a microsecond pause for the reader's eye to go over that punctuation. And the audiobook narrator is going to pause likewise for just that split second. But that's going to say, hang on, we're about to blow your minds, right? So so sometimes that informal punctuation, which is very easy to overuse, is actually really good for signaling that we're about to throw a hard left at the reader. We're about to really surprise them with something. We also beefed up the verbs, like LA is noticing here. Bolted, halted, right? Those really quick and strong and intense verbs that need no adverb because they are already super muscular. What would be the advantage to doing these very short paragraphs at this moment, even though we might not do that for the whole book? What would make them kind of useful in this particular moment? Yeah, Wendy, you're so right. They're heightening that tension. Callie, exactly, emphasizing action. And Sheriff, yes, they do get us engaged, right? Because the thing is, team, about this visually, right? That white space that is left by an incomplete line is like marquee landing lights for the reader's eyes. That negative space on the page tells the reader, oh, go look at where that negative space is. There's something important right there, right? This is also one of the reasons that dialogue is so attention-getting in printed text, is because, right, the rule about dialogue means 1 paragraph for 1 speaker, which means whenever you have significant dialogue, you're probably doing multiple small paragraphs, which gives us multiple resting places for the eyes. So anytime you really have something that is just going to blow the reader's mind, think about a 1-sentence paragraph for it, because that is a way of visually saying, this right here, whatever's in this little 1-sentence paragraph, right? Oh my God, the tower, it's falling. That's a huge realization. That is electrifying David, and it should be electrifying the reader for us to realize he's about to get splatted, right? So let's put that in its own paragraph so that there is no chance that even a reader who is half asleep could miss that, right? And really give them every chance to notice the bigness of that moment. Yeah. So, oh, Callie, I'm so glad you asked this question, right? So you mentioned that there is no he thought included anymore. And so given what we talked about with audiobooks, then maybe we should include the he thought, right? I would suggest Like, so if your question is, can we include them in a non-intrusive way? I think we can. The thing I would steer away from, I might think, the neat thing about this scene is that David is alone. And so it doesn't really super matter whether he's speaking out loud or just just thinking inside his own mind. So the nice thing is we're not at great risk of confusion with if the audiobook reader hears italics instead of quotation marks. It's not like oh my God, Becky, that dress makes you look so fat, where it's really going to change our perception of the scene. So those are probably less necessary here than they would be in certain other scenes that have multiple characters, where it's super important to keep straight, what is being said versus merely thought. The only thing I would really try to avoid is I think the awkwardness that Anastasia had originally was, tell me this isn't what I think it is, he thought. And think and thought so close together kind of sounds a little clunky to me. So if for some reason we did feel like it was important to have a tag there, I would try to avoid using thought just for that one particularly. Yeah. And yeah, I think that's a good question and worth asking. To Cher's point, right? It can pull you out of the action sometime if you have too many of those. But I think in any of these, guys, I was going to mention this later in the evening, but I think this is a fine place to do it. Anytime you're contemplating a change and you might be wrong in that change, I think it's worth asking, which direction is easier to change or to fix? For example, if I use the words he thought or she thought or whatever, wherever I feel like I need to mark interiority, and it turns out that that is distracting or not helpful, then I can simply do a find and replace for the word thought and just go notice, just go hit find the word thought wherever it appears and take it out. But if I don't put it in to begin with, and it turns out I do need it, that might be a little harder to go back and insert later. It might be a little harder to go back and add that. It's possible that I could do a find for all uses of italics and do it that way. If my book doesn't have a lot of other uses for italics, like if I'm not doing foreign language or telepathy or any weird stuff, I might still be able to do it. But whenever I'm on the fence about something, I try to think which direction would be easier to correct for later if it turns out that I do need to correct for it. And I try to lean in that direction. Yeah. Yeah, and let's see. Oh, and LA, yes. Oh, and why he didn't feel the floor tilting. Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's something I think since we're looking at only 2 paragraphs, or I guess now it's 4, that's a good one to put. I actually need to go get this book. Now, I believe she's already got it published. There might be more of an explanation somewhere in this parts I didn't quote. But I'm thinking that my memory of David is that he is a distractible man, and he's very concerned about figuring out where his friends are. He may not have noticed that right off the bat. The thing I did want to mention about the chairs falling over is the last thing I wanted to point out here that we did deliberately is this then another, right? This very deliberate word echoing, as opposed to the sort of more accidental word echoing that we maybe had before, that says, I am repeating these words on purpose in order to heighten their impact, so that you have time to think about the very sinister implications of what you're seeing here. And I mean, if we're going strictly by physics, the chairs probably ought to begin sliding at pretty much the same time if they're on the same surface, but the rule of cool does still apply, and it's kind of neat to have them all go one at a time. It's scarier that way, so we might let that one stand. So, big thought. So the big thing I want to emphasize here to conclude with, right? What we have done together over the past hour has taken this sample down from 122 words to 86 with the same amount of story. We are able to tell this story using 30% fewer words. And this technique is how I shaved 24,000 words from my manuscript without cutting out a single line of dialogue. The movie version of my story in the reader's mind still plays exactly as it did. I didn't have to sacrifice a scene or a character. I didn't have to sacrifice those meaningful moments. All I did was get better at streamlining the telling in a way that not only doesn't hurt the resonance, it actually improves the resonance, right? Like we're using fewer words in this latter example, but we're actually getting more punch. So when we come back from our break, we can talk more about adding that punch, right? About adding power and resonance to what you're writing. The thing I want to ask you briefly then is, having talked about all 5 of these things, are there any questions you have about our first hour together before we go on that break? Or any last thoughts we should think together before we finish part 1? Okay, so Sherry, you flatter me by asking, but yes, the slides are going to be available as their own PDF file in addition to the live recording that you're going to get. So you will have an easy way to see all of these slides, including the little red markings and all of that's going to be there. So yeah, you can make yourself a printed copy if you like, or save it on your computer. And I will be, Michael Knoll, I'll give those to him so he can send it out. But you will also have my email before the end of the class tonight, so that if for any reason they don't show up or you have a problem, I can get them to you the old-fashioned way. Okay, so great. So thanks, y'all. Let's do this. My watch shows that it is just about 7:45 Texas time. So let's take a 10-minute break and come back about 7:55, and we will tackle part 2. If you have other questions in the meantime, I'll go downstairs, get a drink, but feel free to keep using the chat box if you have things you'd like to visit about during the break. But otherwise, check your phones, say hi to your loved ones, reorient yourself in time and space, and I will see you back here in 10 magical minutes. Okay. All right, let's see here. Oh, Callie, what a good question. I think we've got about a minute left on break, but let that be let's do this as a warm up for our next for our part 2 here. I'm really enjoying the conversation you guys have been having about editing tips, about some techniques for kind of powering through it or avoiding that mind-numbing boredom that sometimes comes with editing your work. And I think your thought about editing on paper is a really good one. I hope we'll have time to get more into it toward the end of the evening, but I would give you $1 if you would print out your manuscript on paper. You can even get it spiral bound at the FedEx if you want to feel really fancy. But to sit down before you do any significant work on editing your story, and maybe with a separate little notebook, little chief tablet or yellow tablet or what have you, start making a list as you read of everything that you want to change. Big stuff, you can make little notes on the actual paper pages themselves about, oh, cut out this word or this sentence is dumb or whatever. But the big stuff about this character needs more work, or I think I should delete this scene. If you make a list of those ideas before you try to implement them, I think it's a really good way to make sure that to me, it's almost like making a grocery list before you go to the store. if you make a list of your intended changes while you're still at home, you know, while you're still just reading your work on paper, that lets you do your thinking ahead of time, and you're deciding ahead of time, so that once you're back into the manuscript on the computer, all you really have to do is execute. I find that is it's not a one-stop shop situation. It still needs multiple passes usually, but I just think sitting at the computer is just something about that scroll bar just seems to kill the human brain. It's fine for writing because we can write quickly without really needing to look at what we've already written too much. But for editing, we have to look so closely at what you've already written. I think that I have just seen that scroll bar destroy the self-confidence of so many writers. And I really do recommend reading your work in a different format than you first wrote it. Oh, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that. Okay, so Susan Denard, a blog post, who suggested the same thing. Yes, oh, absolutely. And I hope we'll have time to talk more about those, you know, big picture strategies for the stages of working with your manuscript. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. We are just about at, we're just a little past 7:55. So I hope you have enjoyed your brief reunion with the rest of your life. And we are going to be diving back into our phase 2 of our 10 steps to a leaner, cleaner, meaner manuscript. We talked significantly in our first hour about the art of cutting and what can be cut, and some of the good things that can happen when you do. But we haven't really looked yet at how to power up what remains. So for this portion, I think our metaphor here is kind of like these two pantries, right? The things on the left-hand side are all useful items. We're not throwing them out anymore, but what we're about to talk about is much more about organizing them, how to make the parts, how to help the reader notice what you want them to notice and miss what you want them to miss. And there is an art to it. So to do that, our 5 hot tips. The first one is about turning passive voice active. And I suspect that you've probably heard a fair bit about passive voice already. So the thing that I would like to start with is a quick, not to think this is your first exposure to the idea of passive voice, but I want to make really sure that we are all exactly clear on what passive voice is, because I find that you are very likely to have a well-meaning critique partner or even an editor who is making suggestions to you about what they're thinking is passive voice that isn't actually. So let's say we got a short series of sentences here. 2 things have to be true in order for any of these to count as passive voice. Number 1, the sentence has to contain a to be verb. And there are a very limited number of those. We have am, is, are, was, were, be, being, and been. For those of us here in Texas, we have a bonus word, which is got. It got broken. I got robbed. We got jacked. Right. So all of the sentences that I have up on the screen are, they do contain a to be verb, but that by itself is not enough to say that these are passive voice. Anybody who knows or has an idea, what else has to be true in order to say, okay, that is a use of passive voice? Yeah. Evan, I'm so glad you ate your Wheaties. Yeah, because you're right that technically passive voice is a usage of English in which the subject is receiving the action rather than performing it. And an easy way to test that in the wild is, can you add by zombies at the end of the sentence or at the end of the phrase? So massive weights were lifted by zombies. Yeah. Yeah, okay, if that sentence makes sense, then the weights are being acted upon. They are not acting on their own. So this first example is usage of passive voice. The championship will be held next week by zombies. Does that work? Oh, and yes, Evan is, yeah, he's using Michael Knoll's account, but aren't we all a little bit Michael Knoll on the inside? I think we can keep the spirit of Michael Knoll all year round, even when he's not with us personally. Right. So, so the short story is, right, if it makes grammatical sense to say the championship will be held next week by zombies, because let me tell you, zombies are really good event planners. They can organize like nobody's business. Then what that means was that we didn't previously have an actor, right? The championship is being held. It is being done unto. It is not itself doing. And so, just like the first example, this too is passive voice. But if you cannot readily say, I was gaining muscle by zombies. Oh, and that's okay, LA. Don't worry about it if you get one wrong. We're here to learn. Because let me tell you, being in grammar and style class on a Wednesday night is don't worry, it's not going to impress anyone, but we will benefit enormously from it. If it doesn't make sense to say I was gaining muscle by zombies, then what that means is that even though we have a be verb, which is was, and even though we are using an ing word like was gaining, right? This means we already have an actor, right? I was the person doing the thing. I was doing, I was not done unto. So that's the big idea with this passive voice stuff. I find that a lot of well-meaning people will call something passive and say, oh, your work is too passive, your prose is too passive. And what they actually mean is, I think you're using too many to be verbs, and I feel like your work would be better if you use some other verbs. And that's still a valid comment, but we got to make sure that we understand what we're discussing. So the thing is, and this is the part where I find a lot of those blog posts don't necessarily talk in the detail that I would want, is thinking about when we actually do want passive voice, right? If I've got some example sentences up here, and they do all use passive voice with the to be verb, and she was murdered in her home by zombies. Yeah, they'll do that to you. 37 people were rescued from the water by zombies. Well, they're heroic sometimes, right? I opened my eyes, I was shocked by zombies. Well, probably not super shocked anymore. They're a little bit played out, but okay, see, these are all passive sentences. However, the thing is, I think that there is a case to be made for the passive voice. And in fact, LA, we'll go back in here in just a minute. We'll go back to that fourth example, because you're right, I kind of glossed over it a little bit. For the moment, what would be the logic for keeping it passive? If we want to say she was murdered in her home, why would we not assign an actor in a case like that? Yeah, Wendy, I think you're dead on, right? If the point is that we don't know who did it, then let's leave the emphasis on that unknown, right? That we have more attention or more interest, just like with the chair. When we say the chair fell over and we don't say who did it, well, if we don't say who did it, that leaves a bigger question in the reader's mind, right? That invites them to wonder. So sometimes we want passive voice when the actor is unknown. What about this next one? 37 people were rescued from the water. What would be the logic if we wanted to leave that passive? Yeah, I think you guys are kind of circling around a similar idea, right? Is we can, usually the people doing the rescuing are easy to guess. It's like, well, unless it was literally Aquaman who rescued these people, probably it was the Coast Guard, the professional rescuers. And if we want to, so maybe the actor is known, but they're not as important. The doers maybe aren't as interesting to us as the done unto, right? If we really want the focus to stay on the people who needed that rescuing, then this sentence construction makes a whole lot of sense. It puts those people right up at the front of the sentence where we're most interested in them and they're going to be most memorable to us. And then this last one, when I opened my eyes, I was shocked. Well, so if you can picture for a second, maybe this sentence is the kind of sentence that ends a scene or ends a chapter. And what is the author probably hoping or expecting the reader will do after they read a provocative sentence like that? Yeah, you nailed it, LA. Yeah, cliffhanger, right? Like Wendy's saying, you turn the page, keep reading. Yeah. So this is, the writer is being deliberately ambiguous in order to heighten suspense or interest. It's basically the narrative equivalent of those clickbait stories you see on Facebook that said, this long lost puppy was finally reunited with the Iraqi war veteran. You won't believe what happened next, hoping to get you to click. And it's like, I bet I will believe it. But that's the idea, is to be deliberately vague, because you are going to commercial, so to speak, right? This is the thing that you're ending the scene on, ending the chapter on, and we really don't want to tell too much about what's going on because you want people to tune in or to keep reading or to keep watching. Yeah. So I would maintain that there is a lot of good use for passive voice, really. And what we're only wanting to change is the accidental passive voice, the thoughtless passive voice, the pointlessly passive voice. Those instances, I think, are worth upgrading into the active voice. And to talk a little bit more about that, let's rewind just a quick minute, because we didn't really do example 4 here that LA was asking about. MMA fighting styles were the topic of our discussion by zombies. If you see, here's a question actually. Can you guys notice how in the first 3 examples, the to be verb is paired with another verb? Were lifted, be held, was gaining, right? In all of those cases, right, we have essentially 2 verbs doing one job. We've got the to be verb and then we've got the other. But you notice how in our 4th example, and LA, I think this may account for your ambiguity, is there is no second verb, right? There's just the were. And when we see that, what we're essentially doing, when you have a to be verb that's all by itself, what it's essentially doing is it's serving as an equal sign in the sentence, right? It's MMA fighting styles equals topic of our discussion. So it is possible to have, and okay, listen, I need you guys to promise not to just throw down your laptops in disgust and walk out when I say this. I don't want you to feel nauseous. You may need to have a trash can nearby. But y'all, when you have a sentence like, I was shocked, right? Like here at the very end, and you could add the word by zombies. I was shocked by zombies, or just I equals shocked. Part of the ambiguity or the confusion is because shocked is both an adjective and a verb, right? Like he shocked the subject with a cattle prod. Okay, that's a verb. Shocked, she turned to look at him in astonishment. Okay, there's the verb. So when you have a construction like this, I was shocked, and you could add the word by zombies, because if it's functioning as a verb, then it could have an actor. This is actually what we call semi-passive. Yes, there is such a thing as semi-passive voice. I don't think you need this to live a long and happy life. I don't think this is essential for your career as a crafter of immortal deathless prose. But those instances are sometimes a little harder to parse out, because you could argue that it's passive, you could argue that it's not. And to me, this is sort of the hanging chad of English grammar. It is just super annoying that we can see it both ways. But that may be where, if you ever do run into trouble, pay special attention to constructions like this one at the bottom of the screen, the I was shocked, because they can function either way, depending on whether shocked is meant as an adjective or as a verb. So, if the queasiness has subsided and you aren't completely disgusted, are we okay to keep going? Okay. You're such troopers. All right. Pepto-Bismol and Rolaids are on me, team. Good job. All right. So, yes, exactly, Wendy. This is not going to be on the test. But I'm actually am glad, LA, I'm really glad that you asked, because I think it is important to know, like, yeah, there are deeper levels here that mess us up sometimes. And that's what the copy editors are there to argue. They can argue about how many angels can dance on the head of the pin. Our job is to know essentially how these features work enough so that we get it right the great majority of the time. And the last 10%, listen, if you're writing a great story and you've got, like there's this you're writing the great American novel and this heartbreaking tale, this it's the next James Joyce. It's if you're writing a good story, nobody's going to kick you out of bed because you got one comma wrong, right? Our goal is to show that we really do know the rules and how they work. And if one occasionally slips past you, that's what the other 99 are there to do, is say, nope, he or she or they really do know what they're doing. We can correct this one. It's just an aberration. So, so we talked about passive voice and the pointlessly passive voice that we might want to tune up. Tip number 7 is punching up some of those to be verbs that are left over, where it is not passive voice, but maybe it's not great yet. You can't say her eyes were wet and fearful by zombies, right? This is another word that's functioning as an equal sign, but this is one place where we've got some adjectives, wet and fearful, that might be trying to become a good verb. So let's think about this for a second. So let's meditate on this. What might wet and fearful eyes do? If a gunshot can crack the air or ring out or go bang in our earlier example, what could wet and fearful eyes do? Yeah. Oh, Callie, that's a good one. They could glint. Yeah. They could, even if this person is not crying, even if there's the liquid is not leaking, we could say, her eyes glistened with fear, right? And so that's one way we can take this very plain Jane verb and these two ordinary adjectives and kind of fuse them together into something a little stronger. What about if we say, he was immense, easily twice my size? What might an immense person do when they are standing quite near to you? Just by virtue of their immenseness, I mean. Yeah, they might. Yeah. So what if they, he loomed, he towered over me like some sort of awesome analogy. He hovered. Excellent. Yeah. The guy, sucked the air from the room. Your instinct here is right on, Wendy. I really like what you're thinking about, Cher, because we could, if we really want to think about how immense this person is, we probably want to spend more words on that than a singular verb. But even for the space of a singular verb, towered or loomed still beats was immense. Yeah. Now, conversely, if we have some lines like, that's when I realized the awful truth. Shane wasn't my uncle. He was my father. If we were going to leave those be verbs right where they are and not try to upgrade them, what would be the logic for saying, okay, I'll change the glistening one, I'll change the towering one, but I want these two to stay, Mr. or Mrs. Overzealous copy editor. What would be your logic for keeping those just where they are? Yeah. I think y'all got it. You nailed it, right? And I like the way you say that, Cher, about drilling into the character's feelings and emphasizing. And Susan, yeah, Susan, that's a really good word to use, emphasize, right? Because right here, at this moment in the story, it's not the verb we want people paying attention to. We want 100% of the people, of the attention going to the nouns. Shane does not equal uncle. Shane equals father. And the simpler the verbs are, the more plainly those equal and does not equal signs stand out on the page, the more of the attention we can devote to this huge, huge revelation that's taking place right here. Yeah. And Joan, you're exactly right? This is for shock value. This is a stylistic choice. We're already going to very short sentences because we want people to slow down and really hear what this character is saying. And we might even, I'll tell you, we might even in the finished manuscript version, go ahead and turn Shane wasn't my uncle, he was my father into its own one-liner paragraph, right? So, and hang on one second, I'm going to be keeping talking while I plug in my laptop. But yeah, it's a really, this is one time when we actually need the verbs to get out of the way and let the nouns take over for a moment, because we have a big old, what you might call mic drop moment. And that's one place where I think your to be verbs can and should stay right where they are. So for this one, I would say, yeah, let's punch up those to be verbs, and then coming over to the next one, right? Let's talk about ambiguity for a second. Anna bought a couple of steaks for her puppies and chopped them up. What problem are we having there? Right, you caught it, you hear it, right? Yeah, there is a dire and perhaps fatal ambiguity in the well, and specifically, let's think about this, right? What is the word that is causing so much terrible and perhaps felonious confusion? Yeah, Evan, you win the prize, right? The problem is them is not clear whether it refers to steaks or puppies. And grammatically, a pronoun like this automatically applies to the last eligible noun, the most recent previous noun that it could apply to. And unfortunately, that's the puppies. So to save the lives of these innocent animals, we really need to fix up this sentence, right? We really, and the thing is, you could fix it in any way. You could say, Anna bought a couple of steaks and chopped them up for her puppies, right? And then everything's okay, and the puppies live to see another day, and we're all okay. So some of this ambiguity is pronoun related. She held out her hand. The young man took it and left. And this, there is no pronoun ambiguity per se. The problem is that it's easy to take the term took it very literally. Like, you know what you meant to say, but that's not what we understood, right? We, LA, I don't know where you live, but we have to get a beer after this because I like the way you think. Yes, unless she had leprosy, in which case this is still super rude. This is probably not what the author intended. And some of these ambiguity issues do have specific names, right? There's an agent, her name is Sarah Lapola, and she said once, I'm receiving multiple queries that begin by saying, as an agent who, blah, 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 I think you'll like my novel. And she says, don't do this, writers. She's hashtagged it with dangling modifier patrol, right? But we can see how, here's our problem right here, right? That our subject, the I, is mistakenly sitting right next to that modifier. As an agent who represents young adult fantasy, I think you'll like, well, that's actually saying that the person is representing young adult fantasy, not Sarah, right? So some of these things, there's a name for this kind of ambiguity. It's got a grammatical term. Others, like this one, right? The congressman stayed after the town meeting and discussed the high cost of living with several women. And again, there is no word for what's wrong with this. There is no grammatical term you can apply to it. All the problem is that you meant that the congressman stayed to visit with some of the women after the meeting to discuss the high cost of living. But what we heard was that the congressman was like, oh man, sure is expensive living with all those women. Those mistresses sure do run up the bills. I tell you what, right? And what makes this sort of ambiguity really hard, I think, is that it is almost impossible for you yourself to catch it. What are you going to be relying on, really, to catch errors like the ones that we've been looking at? Yeah, golly, you nailed it, right? You may be able to catch it by doing what Cher suggests and either reading it out loud to yourself or having your Kindle read to you, having the computer read to you. But if all else fails, this is the sort of thing where beta readers are worth their weight in gold, because their head is not full of your intentions, and they are much more likely to see only what you actually wrote and not what you meant to write. So this ambiguity stuff is, the thing is, once you catch it, it's super easy to fix. It's just catching it in the first place. It's a little bit of a tricky business. So you'll definitely want to have those folks there for part of that process with you. Oh, and Callie, I'm glad you asked that question. If you don't have good beta readers, is it something an agent or editor would do? I think that, yes, the sort of things that we've been talking about tonight ought to be caught by a copy editor. Whether that's someone that you hired yourself if you're in publishing independently, or someone who works for the publishing house. That's part of their job, is to catch, the mixed up homophones and the word echoes, those sorts of things. So if you have volunteer help in the form of beta readers who can catch these for you, then that's great. If you don't, then hired help, like an editor that you would retain or that would be provided to you as part of your contract, is your other good line of defense. Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is that the paying readers, don't see stuff like that. And then, so this number 9 is something that you may have already heard a little bit about varying the sentence length and your sentence structure. What are short sentences traditionally really good for? Yeah, Wendy, you got it exactly right. Those are short sentences can be excellent for action and high tension, like we saw with Anastasia Marie's example. Really sharp and sudden transitions. They're also good for emotional impact, like what we saw with that example about Shane was not my uncle, he was my father. Those mic drop moments. And then your longer sentences, right? You can deduce just by contrast from the above that longer sentences are really good for description, for introspection, by which we mean, characters' interior feelings and ruminations, right? Yeah, Share exactly. They slow you down, they enrich you. Complex information where you need to show clear relationships between, multiple ideas in the same sentence. And the thing that I don't see talked about quite as much, they're also really good at hitting the fast forward button for you. So if you have a sentence like, I woke up late for work because the power was out, couldn't get out of my driveway, had a miserable time in traffic. My job backed me up all day long with these stupid clients and their needy requests. And by the time I got home that night, I was exhausted. Okay, well, we just did about 10 hours in one sentence, and we did it pretty easily. So when you need to, like a lot of times, if you really need to move forward in time, what would you do that very clearly signals that to the reader? What would be your first port of call? Yeah, Callie. 2 months later, dot, 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 right. Or just a simple scene break, you know, or a chapter break that says, okay, and so chapter 13 finished that evening, and when we start chapter 14, it's the next day, and we're somewhere totally different, doing something totally different. A lot of times, the big jumps in time, it would be better to do a scene break or a chapter break if that's appropriate to your work. But regardless, this longer sentences can be good for low-key time progression. And of course, we want to vary both of those. We want to have a good, nice mix. Yeah. So this last item is one I'm going to want to spend a good little bit of time on because it's one I think is really important and I don't see it covered very often. So I would like to ask before we do that, is there anything we need to think about with these first 4 items that we've covered fairly quickly? Or any questions that you have about our 6, 7, 8, and 9 items here? Okay, excellent. Good deal. All right, so if I'm late in seeing a posted question, don't worry, we'll pause, we'll back up. But here's the number 10, and y'all, I'm gonna step out and just say I do think this one is worth the price of admission. A lot of times we want to arrange your key sentences to take advantage of natural positions of emphasis. And that may be known to you by a different word, but it's not one that I see a lot of people having prior knowledge about. So I really want to go slow on this and say, thinking about the first line, for example, of Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, right? It says, he was an old man who fished alone in a skiff in the Gulf Stream, and he had gone 84 days now without taking a fish. Where is the sort of the crisis or the need in that sentence? The part that says, oh, this character's got a problem and maybe I want to keep reading to find out how that's going to go for him. Yeah. 84 days without taking a fish, right? And I really should have highlighted the 84 days to here. My underlining's a little short, but please mentally insert that for me, right? So with these positions of emphasis, generally, the last thing you say is the most powerful. The second most powerful place, in our case, is the old man, the character, the person that this story is going to be about. And where do you stuff the details that you actually do need? Because if you didn't need them, you would just delete them. But where do you stuff the details that you do need, but don't necessarily need the reader to linger on or to meditate on with you? Yeah, in the middle, right? Right, the middle is the least powerful place in a given item, in a sentence, in a paragraph, in a scene, in a chapter. And so, and the thing is that we take advantage of that regularly, right? You'll have some, politician person up on television saying, as a man of God and a family and a proud American, and also we have to raise taxes, I am unspeakably proud to be the leader of this greatest nation on earth, right? They stuff what they don't want you to hear in the middle of whatever it is. And we can take advantage of that so that your readers notice what you want them to notice and miss what you want them to miss. So if I've got a sentence here, a couple of lines from my friend Kirk von der Heit, who wrote a book, Urban Fantasy, that was a young adult urban fantasy retelling of Alice in Wonderland. And there's this part where the main character, her name is Emily, she finds the White Rabbit's watch, which in his story is a very powerful magical artifact that controls the openings between Wonderland and the real world. So this is what he's writing in this moment is, you might call it a sword in the stone moment, right? When the young King Arthur first pulls the sword from the stone and acquires that power. This is a big moment in the story, right? And what he's written is, Emily clicked the watch open. The inside looked more like an elaborate compass with tiny gears and cogs than a timepiece. So, thinking about that, is good information, and I think it's well put here. But what is the phrase that he might be really wanting the reader to linger on? Or what is the thing that this mysterious watch could be? Yeah, right. So it could be a compass, right? That is the unknown, the magical and mysterious part. And if we really want the reader to think about that and to be interested in that, then probably we shouldn't shove it in the middle of the sentence where they're most going to forget it, right? So, Joan, to your point, right, that why is a timepiece dangling at the end of the sentence, right? Timepiece is actually what it's probably not, right? So if we rearrange this just a little bit, we can say the tiny gears and cogs inside looked less like a timepiece than an elaborate compass, right? So we could start with what the watch is, or what it has, the tiny gears and the cogs, go to what it's not, which is just a regular timepiece. This thing is not a Rolex, right? And finish with what it might be that really is designed to catch the reader's attention. And, one thing I didn't note on this slide, but that might also be good for us to talk about, is that a lot of times we don't want to spend very much time talking or writing about what's not true, what could have all happened but didn't, what almost happened but didn't, what the thing isn't, right? And so what would be the logic if we want to be careful and not talk too much about what this watch isn't, which is a timepiece, right? Because we don't want the reader to form the wrong impression. If we say that some character, that some character almost spoke up in the meeting or wished she had said X, Y, Z, a little of that is absolutely fine and normal and good. But I think if you spend a long time on the coulda, shoulda, woulda, that can cause the reader to form the wrong impression. They can be, if you say enough about what didn't happen, it starts to sound to the reader like it did happen. And that would be my other logic for putting the timepiece in the middle of the sentence where it is most forgettable. So if that is the thing that we don't want the reader to get the impression of. If this thing is actually something quite different, it maybe looks like a watch, but it's actually quite different, I would tend to stuff that in the middle of the sentence where it's the least noticeable, and save our prime real estate, our beginning and end of the sentence, for the things that really are important and should capture the reader's imagination. Yeah, and you're right, Cher. It's this thing isn't, if it could turn back time, if it were actually functioning as a super watch or something, then we would do this quite differently, right? Then we would want to form a different picture. Yeah. Thinking about that then, this kind of rebalancing, rejiggering, do you need to do it for every single sentence you write? What is the answer you're hoping to hear? Yeah, no. Oh God. Oh no, please say no. Yeah, no. You really don't, y'all. This is not at all necessary for all of your sentences, or even most of your sentences. But here we have a seminal sentence. We have a game changer sentence. This is the moment when the young Arthur picks up the sword. This is the moment when Bilbo Baggins finds the ring. This is the moment when a character, Romeo, finds the note that Juliet left for him, or doesn't, because it's a tragedy. Those kinds of moments, I think, are worth balancing and really thinking about the order of presentation in your sentence, because it really does change the emphasis or the way we read it, right? I don't know if any of you guys are fans of the Dresden Files, but the first line of the series is, "The building was on fire and it wasn't my fault." Which is a really different sentence from, "Well, it wasn't my fault that the building was on fire. but presumably I'm just kind of the diehard can-do cowboy who's going to have to get in there and take care of it, right? This first version, the building was on fire and it wasn't my fault. What does that invite us to think about or wonder about with regards to the speaker? Yeah, exactly. No, you got it exactly right, y'all. It's like, well, why would we think it was your fault? What did you do? Right? And really, what you save for the last really does affect how we hear that statement. And I think for those kinds of moments, this is the first line of the story. First lines are always really important. The one we looked at previously was a game changer moment in the story, or the moment when you first introduce a pivotal character, the main love interest or the main villain, or or somebody like that their entrance for Darth Vader or Scarlett O'Hara has to be just exactly right. Then it's worth it, I think, to drill down and really use these positions of emphasis well. Yeah. Thinking of that in general, remember, this is America, land of the free, so we don't have to do it this way all the time. But in general, we want our sentences to go from old or already established information towards new information, from less to more important information, from less to more emotional impact, and from less to more powerful prose, right? So if we do a slightly rejiggered version of, it's actually from Anastasia Marie's story, right? I could say, if Meyerson was right, the offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had just become a crime scene. And what a sentence like that is going to let me do is start by confirming whatever it was we just heard, right? By saying, if Meyerson was right. So presumably that calls back to some dialogue we just had. Then I will have a elaborate middle, right? I'm actually going to spell out Federal Bureau of Investigation because I want people to go slow and really hear the full name of that agency so they can absorb what I'm just about to tell them, and then finish with the big, sharp, shocking mic drop, had just become a crime scene, right? So we go from the familiar to the new, to the sharp, to the shocking. And that's one way that we can build a sentence that is worthy of ending a whole chapter, a whole scene, a whole part, whatever your divisions are. I think that those bookending sentences, the first one of the scene or the chapter, the last one of the scene or the chapter, those are, some are more dramatic than others. Not every scene or chapter ends with some massive revelation. But I think those are good ones to spend this little bit of extra time on when you get to the revision phase. The thing too about these positions of emphasis is that they do work at every level. So in the beginning of Stephen King's Carrie, for example, right, he starts by saying, okay, there's this news item from the Westover, Maine Weekly Enterprise, August 19th, 1966. Rain of stones reported. It was reliably reported by several persons that a rain of stones fell from a clear blue sky on Carlin Street in the town of Chamberlain on August 17th. The stones fell principally on the home of Mrs. Margaret White, damaging the roof extensively and ruining 2 gutters and a downspout valued at approximately $25. Mrs. White, a widow, lives with her 3-year-old daughter, Carrietta. Mrs. White could not be reached for comment. So, what do y'all notice? What do you see? How are we using positions of emphasis here? Or what is the, let's do them in order, actually. We say that the last thing is the most powerful. What really grabs your attention near the end of this little piece that we're quoted? And it's okay if there's more than one thing. There's more than one right answer here. But what do you really notice prompting you to keep reading? Yeah. No, exactly. So first of all, right, this just by virtue of picking up a book called Carrie, right, and seeing okay, her 3-year-old daughter, Carrietta, then there's an immediate identification of the name and a curiosity about, okay, wait a second, I thought this was about a teenager. She's only 3? Huh, what's the deal with that? Why is she leaving, what happened? Why is Mrs. White a widow? Or why does she live alone with this 3-year-old daughter, right? And to Cher's point, which I think is an excellent one, Mrs. White could not be reached for comment, right? And I think that's a great thing to wonder about, because especially in our modern age where everybody, is looking for their 10 minutes of fame, it's like, why doesn't she want to talk about this? I think I sure as heck would want to talk about it if just, if stones rained out of the sky and messed up my house, I think I'd have a few things to say. I wonder what her deal is, right? And so we're using our last position quite well. And then what are we doing with the first? What is the first thing that really grabs your interest when you start reading this? Yeah, Joan, I think you nailed it, right? Is that rain of stones, which is in those big old all cap letters. That's a first big, sit up and pay attention, right? It's not that we really care about the name of the newspaper or the exact date. 1966 is probably useful just so we can approximately orient ourselves in time. And Maine is useful to know. I'm sorry, Callie, I didn't realize it wasn't showing. But yes, but Callie, I think to your point too, the fact that we're doing this in a news article suggests it gives it a reality. It gives it a confirmation that that this is not just something one random drunk guy said at the bar, but something that really that has the weight of truth to it. And and Joan, I'm so sorry, I did not realize. Yes, if you would like other people to get to see your comments when you type your answers on your to field, right now it says all panelists. If you change that to say all panelists and attendees, then the other students will be able to see your comments as well if you want to do that. I was a little fuzzy on the difference between like the word panelist is kind of a different one to me, but I think that's how that works. Okay, so these positions of emphasis, right? We finish with this nice single sentence sucker punch too. So these are useful on multiple levels, right? Your individual sentences, your paragraphs, and I suspect you already probably know this good and well about chapters, about whole books, about whole short stories. You know you have to start strong. You know you have to finish with a bang, because that's the last thing that they're going to read before they go write your Amazon review, hopefully. But the thing that I would really like to emphasize with these is these are not artificial rigid rules that were developed by a council of bitter grammarian crows in the basement of a Tallahassee Hyatt in 1962, right? These are not just something we made up one day, and they shouldn't be straitjackets that strangle your writing so that you feel like every sentence and paragraph has to fit this one little pattern that we've been looking at here. What they are is a natural mental tendency that we have to read and focus in a certain way. Think about the way that you read a new email, for example, right? How we first look real closely at the sender and the subject line. Pay real good attention to, okay, who is sending me this thing? What are they talking about? And maybe we'll read the first line or two really carefully to catch the tone of voice. Is this person saying, hey, good job on that project that you just turned in? Or, hey, jackass, I'm tired of waiting for you to send me those documents, right? So we'll read very closely at the beginning, and then we read, skim, and then at the end, we're looking for a question mark or an action item, right? We tend to pay, again, very close attention at the end of the email to see, do I have to reply? Do I have to do something here? It's just the way our brain works. And if you know that, then you can manipulate it to control your reader's attention. So for example, let's say, so those major plot points that you really want to make sure your reader doesn't miss, Shane wasn't my uncle, he was my father. Those are going to go right? We might put that at the end of a scene, at the end of a chapter even, so that it's very difficult to miss and it has a lot of resonance. But for you mystery writers out there, people have mystery components in their stories. If you need to put in the correct clue or the right suspect, because you got to play fair, but you don't want the reader to notice them too early or pay too much attention, where might you include some of those things? What could you do to help the reader not notice them, even though they are reading the words? Yeah. Go ahead and, no, you're exactly right. Stick it in, like, maybe if we're interviewing 5 suspects, then probably, it could be number 2 or number 4 that did it, maybe number 3. If we are examining a room, then maybe the key item is one that's around the it's maybe a third of the way through the list or halfway through the list. Yeah, we're gonna kind of hide that stuff after we've had a very big, strong first impression, and the reader is a little bit more in cruise control mode. Yeah. So so this positions of emphasis stuff, I don't know. I think that it's something that we can use in a lot of our writing, and not just the actual story that you're working on. I'm thinking about, well, LA, you made a good point earlier about this is how like how scientific reports are listed, right? With the least important author in the middle, because the first and the last are the prime real estate. But y'all, think about your blog posts that you might write. Think about the articles that you might someday produce. Think about how you craft your, Facebook posts or things where you're trying to get people's attention on your work. Think about your back cover blurb on your book, and honestly, think about your GoFundMe page that you might someday need, or your Kickstarter, your Indiegogo. Controlling the order of your information so that you hook the reader early, you lead them through, and you finish with a very clear point, whether that point is the butler did it, or buy my book, or click here to subscribe. Being able to organize and keep that information in a good flow is going to be so useful to you no matter what hat you're wearing on a given day. And I suspect you've already done a lot of that already. So we're just about ready for our second break, and I'll have some general editing tips for you after the break. But before we do that, are there any last questions or thoughts you would like to have about positions of emphasis or any of those prior points up here on the screen? All right. Well, thank you, LA. I'm so glad you find this helpful. This is, the thing that makes me the thing that just wilds me about this stuff is I took a bachelor's in history and a master's degree in English, which required learning Latin, which required all these papers and, thesis and all this business. I have had English training out the wazoo in literature and Latin and linguistics, foreign language, rhetoric, poetry, you name it. And I did not hear about positions of emphasis until I was hanging out at a science fiction convention with an English teacher living in Bulgaria, and he dropped this for me. And I'm just like, I kind of want about $20,000 worth of my tuition back, because I feel like this should have been covered. But Cher, to your point about another term for positions of emphasis, I think I have heard it used sometimes people will say your power places or your power words. I think I heard that at a high school one time, and they were trying to get the kids to think about how you end your sentences. I think they were talking more about endings than beginnings. But if any of you have heard this same concept under a different name, please do put that in the chat box for us, because I think it's always helpful to have a synonym for anything that you're working with. Yeah. Okay, good deal. So I think our mission is clear, y'all. We are going to get the term positions of emphasis trending on Twitter. Here we go. Hashtag POE. In the meantime, let's go ahead and take our last break. Let's come back at 9 o'clock even, and I will make it my mission to thrill and delight you in our last 30 minutes with general editing strategies like what we were talking about at the first break about editing your work on paper and things like that. We can have some questions sometimes about beta readers and how to get them. We will do all the big picture. We've been zoomed in pretty closely on an individual page for tonight, but we can use our last 30 minutes to zoom out and talk more about your big picture process to whatever you're interested in. So please take your last 10-minute break. If you have any questions that you already know you want the answers to on editing process, go ahead and put those in the chat box for me, and I'll make sure we prioritize those when we come back. And I'll see you back here in 10 minutes at even. Okay, so I think we are just about at 9 o'clock and got a couple of really good questions in chat. One that I haven't had time to type an answer to that we might could cover as our warm-up is, Sherry, you mentioned sometimes you see dialogue, you have a dialogue question, right? Where sometimes one paragraph has character A's words, but character B's actions. And that can read a little awkwardly. So if we were going to talk about that, about editing and what to look for, I think that there are times when you cannot avoid, we know that the general rule is one actor, one paragraph, right? So if I have a character named Bob, and it's like, okay, so Bob says this, and Bob goes over here, and Bob thinks a certain thing if we're in his point of view, and that all goes in one paragraph because that's his stuff. And then I've got Shirley over here, and Shirley is saying something and doing something, and then okay, so Bob's stuff goes in one paragraph, Shirley's stuff goes in another paragraph, and we tend to keep those two things separate for clarity, right? That's where this one actor, one paragraph rule goes. I think that's a good rule to follow, but there are times when Shirley is going to kind of sneak into Bob's paragraph a little bit, especially if we're at his point of view. Like, now, sweetie, I don't think you need to get so angry, Bob said, approaching, like coming to sit at Shirley's left side. She looked angry. He knew what that was going to mean, right? Where he's still the one acting, but she is getting a mention, even though she hasn't spoken yet or done anything yet. So yeah, probably there's going to be times when you get a little bit of mashed potatoes in the peas and vice versa. Sometimes they just touch. With regard to, so I do still think it's worth it to try to separate them into their own paragraphs as much as possible. When Shirley does tell him what she's mad about, or she flinches away from him as he sits down and she says, I don't know what kind of nerve you have. Okay, that'll be time for her paragraph. And you're going to do that to show that you know how the rules work. But again, I guess my perspective has changed recently because, again, paragraphs don't show up in the audiobook. So whatever you're doing still needs to work, even if we have no benefit of indents and new lines and paragraph marks and so on. And so it takes a little bit of mental recalibrating to practice looking at it from both the eye and the ear point of view. But I think that's an excellent investment of your time. And that, if you can't avoid a little bit of Shirley in the Bob paragraph, I don't think you need to lose any sleep over it. You're going to show us you know the rule by getting it mostly exactly correct for the other 98% of the time when there is no ambiguity. Yeah. So super glad that you asked about that. And yeah, we can kind of spend this last half hour to things that you guys that are of interest to you all. I hope that you can see my screen. I hope I'm sharing it correctly, where you can see divide and conquer with our 3 levels of editing. Generally, we start with content and developmental editing, and that's what I do the most of personally. I make most of my living these days as kind of a developmental or pre-developmental editor, working with people on big picture story revisions and big picture story ideas for people who are just starting out. And that's the kind of editing where we do major stuff first. We say, is this plot line working? Is this character well placed? Should chapter 10 actually be chapter 1? Should this be 2 books, right? And then usually we would go down, then at that stage, once the developmental editing is complete with the editor you hired or your publishing house, it'll be time for copy editing. And that's what we've really been looking a lot at over the past couple of hours, is those micro level polish and stylistic improvements that are really gonna improve the telling of the story. And then finally, generally the last pass in a traditional publishing house is the proofreading stage. And all that's worried about is typos and formatting and, making sure that it's supposed to be a comma, not a semicolon, and so on and so forth. I have a 4th part to this presentation, which is about gathering, interpreting feedback, which we can look at more if you have an interest in that. But in general, our best practices are to work big to small, just like we've outlined on this slide, right? We don't want to waste time giving a pedicure and putting nail polish on the toes of a foot that we are about to amputate, right? So it's a really good idea to take care of the big picture. You don't want to waste time editing a bunch of things that are going to end up on the cutting room floor. So that's why we generally prefer to work big to small. It's also a really good idea to let each of your drafts rest between editing passes. Stephen King says a month. Sometimes that's not always possible, but it really does help to put it in a drawer for a while, so that and work on a different part of the process or work on a different project, so that you can kind of come back and pull it out of the drawer and read it more like a real reader would. The thing I would emphasize about that let the draft rest imperative is that you can still be doing something to help yourself with this story. All you're going to do is not be looking at your actual manuscript. So what else can you guys think of? Like, yeah, you might have a separate project to work on, and that's great. But even if you want to keep plugging along on this project, what are some things you could do to be productive with it while you are not reading the actual manuscript? Yeah, Wendy, you're so right? You could do, if you're going traditional publishing, you could be writing your query letter. You could be working on your synopsis. You could be doing research, for those parts that you kind of, fudged on. This is a good time to actually go back and look up how that stuff actually works. You could be giving it to beta readers to read. Let them read it. You're gonna have to wait for them to give you feedback anyway. So let's have you take a vacation from it while they're busy with it, right? You could be working on, even if you're independently publishing, figure out, okay, what kind of cover art do you want? What kind of artist do you want? There's lots of work to be done for any book outside of the actual manuscript, right? And then in general, we want to pack into as much of each editing pass as we can, so that you're not reading the same manuscript. So you're not reading this manuscript 10,000 times, so that you're not, reading and rereading and rereading until your brain turns to mush and you can't even see what you've done anymore, right? So for that big picture stuff, which we haven't really talked about a lot yet, I mentioned at the end of the first break, I think it's a wonderful idea to print out your draft. It gives you a wonderful sense of accomplishment, but it's also been scientifically shown that our brain notices printed matter more than it does screen matter. So we are better just neurologically. Reading is not a supernatural act. Our brain hardware is not really optimized for reading, but we do tend to remember pages more than screens. Think about the last time you were reading a book and you needed to go back to look something up and you're like, okay, I don't know what page it was on, but I know it was in the top right-hand corner of a right-hand page, right? Your brain made a map for you. And so sometimes it's good to employ that mapping ability by printing your draft. I think it's a wonderful idea too, to take that, big old printed draft, sit down, with some colored pens or whatever you like, but also have a blank notebook or a piece of notebook paper or a yellow chief tablet, whatever, that is making yourself a revision to-do list as you are reading your story. This is you making a menu and a grocery list before you go to the store. It's getting your thinking done ahead of time about, oh yeah, see, I don't really like the way that he comes in chapter 3. I might hold off introducing him until chapter 6. Right, let me write that down. Note to self: nix Bob in chapters 3 through 5. Enter in chapter 6. Okay, cool. I think it's a great idea to target accidental repetitions. And I know that you know what that means for copy editing, right? Those word echoes we were talking about, the chair and then another chair or whatever the thing was. But what I mean in content editing is accidental repetitions of plot device, right? How many times in this story is there a big old misunderstanding between the hero and the heroine that they could sort out if the two would just listen to each other for 5 minutes? Or sometimes accidental repetitions of setting, like how many scenes in this story take place in a coffee shop just because that was where you decided to put it, right? The thing about those accidental repetitions is that in your first draft, you are very likely to, whenever you're stuck, to reach for something that is easy for you to imagine or easy to write, easy and fun. But just because you repeated accidentally, doesn't mean you have to delete them. You could delete some of those repetitions and say, okay, so I'm going to make 4 out of the 6 coffee shop scenes take place somewhere else. But you can also make repetitions deliberate. There is a wonderful author that I work with, and she has the world's best story about a menopausal vampire. This poor woman, Veronica, has been 51 years old for the last 200 years, and she is sick of it. And it turns out in this course of the story that there's a way to become human again. It involves finding and apologizing to everyone you've turned into a vampire. So this is a fantastic road trip story that kind of uses the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous as its plot, as a map. And I noticed that the author was putting a lot of the scenes in motels, right? Because it's a road trip story. And so I said, but Pam, one motel looks like the next, and we're not really building urgency here. So what we decided to do, instead of just having more stuff not happen at a motel, we decided to do a deliberate repetition of those motel scenes so that the story feels like it's getting darker and more urgent as we go forward. So they start out in a nice Marriott. Then they go to, a Days Inn, and then it's a Motel 6. And then by that time, it's not safe to use credit cards anymore because the cops are on her trail for that one guy she killed. And then they're down to the Motel 2, and then they're running out of money. So they're down to the Clown Shack on the interstate. And now our repetition has a purpose and a progression. And we are actually using that repetition to enhance a mood or to drive the story. And that's what I mean about maybe repeating some things again, but doing it deliberately in the revision and figuring out how can I use this repetition to my advantage. The other thing that I find so useful with these developmental edits is to, I know that we hear all the time about conflict and conflict is super important and you got to have conflict on every page. And yeah, that's true. But I think that the word contrast is even bigger. I think it is underneath all conflict and even some other things that aren't conflict. And those contrasts, think about a buddy cop movie, right? Think about like Lethal Weapon or something like that, or Rush Hour, you know, with Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker. What is usually the contrast between the two detectives in a show like that? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. And we can have more than one of those contrasts, right? So, Wendy, to your point, right? So you probably have one person who's, you know, like that older cop, like Callie, like what you're saying, the serious one, the organized one, the guy who's the cynical one, the department veteran who's been there for 30 years, you know, who's got a, you know, dim view of human nature, seen it all, done it all. And then there's the wacky, hotshot, maverick young guy who's out to bring some scumbags to justice, right? And that what that contrast between, they're both good guys, right? They're both police officers. They have a profound desire to solve the case or whatever it is they're doing. But the contrast between them helps keep interest even when the bad guy is nowhere on the screen. A lot of that contrast is conflict, right? They're going to argue about what donut shop to stop at, and that's going to be funny. You know, it's a funny kind of conflict instead of the real serious one when the guns come out. But sometimes the contrast is just the different, it's not a conflict. It's just they're both using their really different skill sets to solve some common problem, right? And so a contrast between two characters like that, or between a character and their environment, you know, think about Legally Blonde, where you know, this ditzy blonde gal is at the, you know, the big shot fancy law school, and it doesn't look like she belongs there. Or think about Miss Congeniality, when you know, the lethal killer agent played by Sandra Bullock is having to go undercover at a beauty pageant, and it's super awkward. Those contrasts are everywhere inside your manuscript. And the more you can get good at noticing them, the more you can deliberately turn up the dial on those contrasts when you need to. Because contrast is fundamentally interesting to the human brain. It is, our brains are actually wired to look for contrast. Our ancestors were looking for brightly colored berries in the dark foliage, you know, so they could find food. Or they were trying to avoid the brightly colored, you know, snake that in, you know, under the underbrush, so they didn't get bit. So contrast is interesting to our brains. It is a red shirt on a beige background. It is cold ice cream on top of hot apple pie. And the more you can consciously manipulate that in your work and build those contrasts to be funny or serious or shocking or sad or whatever it is you want to do, the easier it's going to be for you to keep your reader's interest all the way through your story, even when we're between major conflicts. Yeah. And then I think the last big thought I had on the developmental editing side is, you know, a good page could advance the plot, it could reveal character, it could develop the setting, it could, you know, it could do world building, it could do a lot of things. But a really great page is going to be doing at least two things at once. I see a lot of this in writers' first drafts where they have some big scene that's like 10 pages long, and I might ask them, "Oh, well, why do you want to keep this scene?" And they said, "Well, I need it to show that he's a good guy." And you know, my thought is always like, "Okay, well, I just have him turn off his phone at the movies. There, he's a good person. What else can we do with this?" We don't have to delete that 10-page scene, but oftentimes it needs to be carrying more or doing more. And that's a great thing to be looking for in your, when you go to revise. So I know I'm throwing all that out at you in fairly short order. So let me pause here. Are there any, do we need to talk more either about one of these 5 things or other techniques for big picture story editing? Let me make sure you have plenty of time to ask those questions before we move on and go down the scale. Okay, and while you're thinking about that, oh, good, we have good questions. All right, let's see. Um, Oh, Callie, thank you for asking about the 7-layer dip. Okay, so I said that good editing is like making a 7-layer dip. Are there actually 7 parts or narrative modes of writing? Description, dialogue, action, etc., or was that a generalization? Yes, like that is definitely a generalization. There are, according to some classical modes, some classical views, there are 4 main narrative modes, which is to say narrative, i.e. action, exposition, aka explanation about how something works, argument or persuasion, which is convincing somebody to do something, and I forget the 4th one, but Wikipedia will tell us. I think if you're interested in that topic, I would use that as your Google term, narrative modes, or modes of writing. It's one of those things where, you know how it's the same thing where some people say, oh, there's 3 kinds of plots. No, wait, somebody else says there's 8. No, wait, somebody else says there's only 7 plots. You can count them differently. I think that a really good thing to do is to think about what the major ingredients are of your kind of storytelling. Like if you're doing fiction, like as a novel, then yeah, those main pieces we've been talking about, description, dialogue, action, and I would say character interiority, interior thoughts or point of view would probably be 4 of your big pieces there. But that may change for someone who's writing a different kind of work. So yeah, and Wendy, I'm really glad that you brought up the senses, you know, using at least 3 senses in each scene or chapter. It's really easy for us to default to just what we see and hear, because that's the primary senses that most of us use in interacting with the world. So revision is a great time to be asking, okay, but what is that? Does that guy, okay, they get in the elevator and there's a weird guy in there. What does he smell like? Okay, your revision is a great time to really try to dig in and say, okay, now what's it like to be right next to that campfire? You know, like I mentioned the cracking, the popping of the wood, but what about the little sparks, you know, floating up? Or what about that nice pine log smell? Or what about what we're making on the fire? You know, or what does it feel like to put your hands up close to it? Yeah, that's a great time to be thinking about that. A couple of little bonus tools for you guys that may be useful to you. A lot of my clients have been getting some mileage out of this, so I'll be happy to share it with you. A lot of the folks I work with have one completed rough draft, and they are trying to decide how to revise it. And so what we sometimes do with them is we make a scene chart together. And in this scene chart, you can see a small example up on the screen. We can walk through it. Our first column is literally just what happens in the scene. And this is just for you. So you can make it a short note, like this author did. The tribe is pulled from the train and confronted by Manfred. Okay, so her main characters are, the tribe is a group of teenagers and Manfred is the main villain. Okay, so that's what happens. The second column is, why do you, the writer, feel like you need this scene? What are you accomplishing with it? If I told you, delete this scene, and you would say, text, I can't possibly delete this scene. This is introducing the external plot as well as setting up the world and establishing the main character's voice and her dilemma. And then I might say, wow, that's 3 things. You are multitasking with this scene. Good job. So in the second column, a lot of what we're looking for is, are you getting more than one thing done? So that's a good thing there. And the third column is, what are the readers supposed to be interested in and wondering about at this moment in the story? I think this is the part that's probably just about impossible to do while you're still writing the rough draft. You're busy, like you're the theater manager, right? So you're trying to get all the actors on you're the stage, the play director. So you're trying to get all the actors on their marks and do their choreography and figure out who says what lines and do they move upstage or downstage to do it and, tape the floor. It's not until revision that you're ready to kind of sit in the audience where a real theater going attendee will sit watch the actors do what you told them to do, you know, read your draft, and then say, oh, wait, that's not working. Nobody can see you. We got to do something different. So this third column, I think it's really important to switch from the writer's hat, the second column of what you need the scene to do, over to this third column. What are the readers supposed to care about right now? You know that you need that scene to set up the future reveal that's going to come 100 pages later, but the reader doesn't know that. The reader doesn't care about later. The reader isn't interested in doing homework for some future test that they're supposed to be studying for. What is their satisfaction or curiosity right now? Why are they interested right now in this thing that you're telling us about? You can add other columns if you feel like you need them. This author had a trouble with, she struggled with a protagonist that she felt like was kind of passive. So she had a fourth column called, Is Birdie Making an Important Choice? Just to try to, you know, keep a track of her protagonist's activity. And then I think she had a fifth column called Fix It or F It, where she decided whether or not to keep the scene. You can do whatever you like. But this would be, this is one way that you can do kind of what a developmental editor does and make a bird's eye view sort of catalog of your draft before you start to edit it. You can also, so this is a good way to kind of catalog or chart what you already wrote. And then, and the thing that we might mention is, y'all, you could do this for somebody else's book. You could do this for a Tony Hillerman book or a Danielle Steele novel or whoever it is that you like. If you want to know how that author does all this great stuff that they're doing, practice taking apart one of their stories. Like chart that, you know, like it's when you're trying to build a Frankenstein, it is super useful to dissect a frog or two. So anytime you're frustrated with your own work or you just need a different exercise, yeah, do a piece of some other novel. You don't even have to do the whole thing. If you're struggling with endings, go story map the last 100 pages of To Kill a Mockingbird or something, whatever you want to do. So this is a good way, this catalog is a good way to, you know, to chart and get a long distance view of your whole story before you try to change anything. Once you have some changes in mind, the other tool that I would recommend you're using is just a story write-up, which is basically, it's like a synopsis, except it's as long as you want, and no one else ever has to see it. So you don't have to fit a word count. You don't have to send it to an agent. But this one that my author did, she wrote the whole story as it was in black. And then she tested out revisions she was thinking of making in red, so that she could kind of practice telling herself a summary of the new version of the story to make sure that she liked it before she actually committed to all of that heavy revision work inside the actual pages themselves. We were talking about making some pretty radical changes about splitting up the group of heroes at one point, and maybe this character that lived is actually going to die, and that's really going to affect the protagonist if her brother dies. Those are things you kind of want to play test first. You know, is that going to break your protagonist, or is that something that will really add a lot to the story? So testing out your major revisions in summary form first can be a nice way to, to make sure that you are on the right track with them. They do sort of work the way that you want them to before you actually go and change 300 odd pages. I know that we're just about at the end of the time, but so I'll stop here and just say, if there's any last questions that you have about any phase of the editing process, doesn't have to be the content or developmental editing, but any last wrap-up questions, team, with our last few minutes together? And I'm going to fast forward while you're thinking about that. Okay, so I know we've run up just about the minute. I guess the last thing that I really wanted to put to you actually comes from our gathering and interpreting feedback section, and that will it will come. We'll get you this whole deck, at the end of the night. So don't worry, you're going to have even the things we didn't really have time to cover. But the thing I would love to add is, oftentimes a writer's first ideas aren't their best ones. Just because it's your first idea, right? But what I don't hear said nearly as much, but which is absolutely just as true, is that editors' first ideas often aren't their best ones either. And anytime an editor or a beta reader, critique partner, whoever, suggests making a drastic change to your story that you're not sure you agree with, y'all, it is not only okay, but vitally important to say, I hear what you're saying. I am open to making changes. Can you tell me more about what problem your suggestion is meant to solve? Because very often, as Neil Gaiman noted, people who notice a problem are usually right. People who suggest a solution are usually wrong. And the more confidently you can say, I hear what you're saying. I'm open to making changes. Can you tell me more about what problem you're trying to solve? The better able you are to decouple good problem noticing with terrible problem solving. That like oftentimes a solution is stupid. It's absolutely wackadoo. This you should never do what they told you to do. You shouldn't put, an alien invasion into your Amish romance. It's just not a good idea. But maybe there is a legitimate problem that they're pointing out that you can solve in a better way if you understand it better. And I would love for you to feel empowered enough to do that, to ask those questions, to take what part of the advice is useful and to ditch the rest. So, and Cher, I see what you're saying, that the critique group made you a certain suggestion, and you took that suggestion and wrote all these chapters, and then you ended up deleting the chapters. Yes, I hate that has to happen so often. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but really, team, I think it's always a good idea to make sure that you only implement the changes that you understand, that you're excited about, even if it's going to be hard work, because you can get the vision for what they're suggesting. You can see how it's going to improve your work. And I guess we'll finish with a question from LA about book recommendations, right? It's a novel for developmental content revisions. Any other book or recommendations? I think if you are writing very character-driven stories that have to do with a character overcoming a flaw or a wound, Lisa Krone's Story Genius is a really good book. I don't think her advice applies universally to all genres, but for anything that involves deep character, interior struggle and journey, she's really good. I also really, really like Donald Moss and his, he wrote, oh goodness, now I'm trying to put it to mind. Writing the Breakout Novel was the first one he was really well known for. The Emotional Craft of Fiction is newer. The thing I like about him is that he is not you have to do this and that and follow the hero's journey every step of the way. He is really good at asking you questions like, is there a moment in your story when the main character figures out what is really going on? If there is such a moment, what would happen if the main character thought they understood what was really going on, but their understanding turned out to be wrong or incomplete? He's really good at those prompts, those kind of guided exercises. So if you like that, his work is fantastic. And yes, Cher, thank you for adding that too. Writing 21st Century Fiction. That's another good Donald Moss book. There's lots of good ones out there. And if you all have suggestions or things, books or resources you've enjoyed that have really helped you, please go ahead and put that in the comments while we're wrapping up the class so that everyone can benefit from that. The thing that I would say is that I know that there's always more to say. I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I really appreciate you doing this with me and participating so enthusiastically. I can't tell you how much I rely on that, especially when I can't see your shining faces and hear your glorious voices. If you would like to, if you have other questions or you have other things you want to talk about, please hit me up. My email is tex@thetextfiles.com. And you can always go to writersleague.org to get that list of upcoming classes and events from the Writers League of Texas. They have a fantastic programming slate. And Evan, if there's any last words you want to say about those or reminders, please feel free to jump in, because I know you've got a full slate of fabulous offerings pretty much every day of the week.
Yeah. I just want to say, if you are interested in checking out any more of the Writers League stuff, feel free to check out our website, writersleague.org. There we have a full calendar of all we're doing. Like this Thursday, I believe, yes, tomorrow, we're having our last Third Thursday event at not Book People, I'm sorry, that's wrong information. Somewhere else, check our website. It's the last one of the decade, so check it out. It's going to be a really good one. We also have a podcast that we put out monthly. It's just a recording of those Third Thursday events. Has very good information. Thank you so much, Tex, for this wonderful class. It was super helpful to me. I'm sure it was helpful to everyone else in the chat. And yeah, everyone have a good night.
Yeah, we'll see you soon, y'all. Thanks so much.
All right, bye.